Hi, everyone. Today, I'm very happy to speak with two very talented people who I've been working with for a while now. I have here Dr. Juliana Brown, who goes by Jules, and I have Dannii Bernstein Mazor. These two people have done an amazing job translating the work of the heroes of October 7th, which is now available on Amazon, is right here, actually. And so we're going to be talking about the book and about the translation process. And I'm hoping that they could shed some light on the art of translation, in particular to this book. So let's jump in here. Let's start with you, Jules. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
I'm originally Canadian, born and raised in Canada. I first made Aliyah when I was 17. I say first because I lived in Jerusalem and did my first degree there for 5 or 6 years. And then I went back to Canada for a while. And then I missed this too much. I missed all the crazy too much. So I moved back. I think it's been about 13 years now, 13, almost 14. So I've been back for a while. I live in Kilcool. I've got 5 kids, ranging from almost 22 to 6. And I've been a translator basically since I realized that it was a real profession. Um, I mean, we've all, as kids grown up sort of reading stuff in translation without really understanding that somebody actually sat down and did it. And at some point, I'd been lecturing at university for a while, and I had colleagues and professors actually, asking me to translate stuff from one language to another. And suddenly I realized that I enjoyed that a lot more than the actual lecturing. So I sort of pushed that aside, and I've been working as a translator ever since.
That's wonderful. And Danny, what about you? Can you tell us about yourself?
Sure. I'm Dannii. I live in Paradise Chanukokro, just around the corner from Jules. I'm married, I have 2 kids, and I've been in Israel in a much more straightforward trajectory than Jules's story. I made Aliyah almost 18 years ago from London, England, having lived in a few different places before. But been here ever since and did a very kind of classic Yerushalayim to Tel Aviv and then out to suburbia journey. And I have been in the world of editing, translating for the past 5 years or so, um, as a kind of pandemic pivot. But I've just always been writing and always been editing in some format or another. And this is how I ended up joining this project.
That's wonderful. So maybe you guys could give me some background because I have spoken with Hadassah, who appears on a different interview video, and she gave us some background about the book that she's written, The Heroes of October 7th. And I understand that this book started off as a social media campaign.
Mhm.
A social media project, and then it gained a tremendous amount of popularity. First, it originated in Hebrew, and then the stories were translated into English and Hebrew. So I'm curious if you could tell me a little bit more about how you got involved in this project, and then we'll talk more about what the translation process was like. Jules, let us
Uh,
start.
I actually got a message from Hadassah, who she also lives in Pardes Cool, and it's a very small community. So there's always somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. I hadn't actually met her before this, but friends of my kids who had babysat for her, there's sort of this, some sort of connection. And suddenly I got a text from her maybe a month or so after the war started. I think at some point in November, from what I remember. And she introduced herself and she explained very briefly about this website that she had started up with stories for the kids and what it involved. And she said that they had put together a translation team and that somebody had recommended me and would I be interested in volunteering and doing that. And at the time, again, this is only 5 or 6 weeks after the war started. I, like most of us, was in a complete state of shock. Um, I couldn't do anything. I was completely incapable of getting any of my normal translation work done. And I found myself, again, like most of the women that I know, um, most of us were just sitting around during the day, staring out into space and thinking, what just happened? You know, in between sort of making sure that people got fed and people got off to school and whatever. We were all just we were stunned. And but something about this project, a little bell went off in my head, and I said, "This I can do," because I knew that if it was something that had to do with what was going on around me, that I would be able to connect to it. And so I phoned her up and we chatted a little bit, and she put me in touch with Allison, who was heading up the translation team in English. There's a separate team in French. And I started working on it, and it was really a matter of do as much as you can as fast as you can, because unfortunately, and this may sound a bit strange, unfortunately, there were so many stories, and I say unfortunately because not every story has a happy ending. Many of them don't. The heroism in them is inarguable, but they're very difficult stories. And every time that we sit down to work on one, there's a real person or several real people behind this. But somehow it fit into the situation and the emotion of what was going on at the time, and is still going on. And I just got to work on that. And so I worked on the website for probably 8 or 9 months. And then Hadassah told me that she wanted to put a collection of the English stories out as a book, and would I like to edit them? And at that point, I rang up Dannii immediately because I can't get these things done without her.
So, how many stories were collected in this project?
Oh my gosh, Dannii, you'd probably know better than I do.
Well, so as Jill said, there's this incredible team who started work on the website, headed up by Alison. And actually, there are hundreds of stories, and they're still being translated for the website as we go. But what we had decided, or I guess what Hadassah had kind of decided on, was that the exact stories from the Hebrew book would be translated to the English,
Mhm.
and that's where I came in with
Mhm.
Jules.
Okay. Okay. And so you were both translating these stories of heroes who range from medics to soldiers in Israel to regular people. And this was all going on while, this is immediately, post October 7th, right?
Mhm.
And both of you live in Israel. The whole team lives in Israel. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what that was like for you to work on these stories while you yourself were personally grappling and dealing with this horrific time. And as I say this, I realize, I mean, we are now November 2024. We are still
We're still
in
there.
this horrible mess with 101
Absolutely.
hostages still in Gaza. And the stories of heroes are still coming out. Thank God there's, tremendous amount of outstanding and generous people out there. But what was it like for you both to work on these stories while you're trying to run your household and live in Israel, and then you have the news coming in?
For me, like I mentioned, it was almost it was perfect for me, which sounds pretty grim, but um really for the first few months, that like this book, these translations, which at the time it was just the website, but these translations and some other work that I was doing in Hasbara were really the only things that I could work on properly, because they were um, so close to what I was living on a day-to-day basis. Um, And there was no need for me to sort of separate myself from this reality around me, and try and work on, I don't know, the translation for a municipality in Spain, who were trying to sell their new hotels to tourists. Um, so for me, it made a lot of sense. And I didn't feel like there was any disconnect between what I was doing at work and what was going on in my life, which was utter chaos. I had at the time my eldest child had just been evacuated from a kibbutz in the north. My second one was and is still serving up north in the army. And then, of course, three small kids trying to figure out what's going on. Um, and my working on the project also made it easier for me. It was sort of a back and forth situation where I could bring my own experience to my translations, but I could also use the translation of these stories to talk to my younger children. And with my 8-year-old especially, um, I don't think that there's been a single Shabbat since I started working on this that she hasn't taken. Originally, we'd print out stories for her, and then the book came out in Hebrew. And every Shabbat, even now, she'll just take the book, whenever she's stressed out, and she'll flip through and read, a couple of stories because they make sense to her on her level. And I think that it was really a godsend, very bizarre one, but Nistarot Darkei Ha'el, things are generally strange at the moment. So
Yeah.
Mhm.
How
Yeah.
about you, Dannii? What was it like for you?
For me, it came at a slightly different moment. Just like quite like so many people in Israel, I'm sort of between those populations where my husband wasn't called up because he's just beyond the age, and also my children are quite young. And so I was also very caught up in the physical volunteering, just this incredible outpouring of like, how can we help after October 7th? And I think I was keeping myself busy with that. And as Jules said, like, who could work? Nobody could concentrate. I would sit down at the computer and just be like, what am I doing? There are so many people who need help right now. And so I kind of physically got caught up in a lot of the incredible kind of things that were happening in those first few months. And then around March 2024 is when Jules called and said, look, there's this book. And I had sort of heard about it on social media. But for me, it was like very moving because it came at this moment when the initial physical volunteering started to die down. And everyone was sort of just made to go home and look around us and be like, what has happened? And then the stories came to me. And so it was actually like a very moving process that even now when I read the book, there are so many stories that we hadn't heard. And we had heard a few of them, maybe we'd seen their faces on TV, but there were so many people that I hadn't heard about. And as Jules said, it really helped me process it a little bit. Again, it was very, very new. We were talking about March of 24, but it helped me start to process it with my children who had so many questions. And I think one of the incredible things, I think Hadassah writes it in the introduction, is that from every direction we were being told, don't expose your kids to this in any way. Protect them from all of the horrors and all of the horrific news. But kids will find out. And so these stories came to me at a moment where I was like, they're hearing things, and I want to be the address for that. I
absolutely.
don't want a child on the playground to tell them, did you hear about so and so? And so it actually kind of in sort of a grim and morbid way, like actually was incredible in that way to help us work through it with our kids.
That's really fascinating. And I'm curious to explore this both more with you, because as you say, these stories are all in the back with the background of war and all the terrible events that happened on October 7th and the aftermath. And so let's just talk like on a macro level, how do you address these stories? And the events, how do you address it to young children? How do you see that being or let's start like this. How do you see that being expressed in the book? let's
I
focus on
think
the.
I think that what happens in the book and in the stories in general, in English, right? And I'll be very careful here. The English text, the translations are meant for an audience that is utterly different than the intended reading audience for the originals, for the Hebrew texts, and for the book that came out originally in Hebrew, meaning for our children who are being raised here in Israel. Um, our children's reality, even before the war, once upon a time, was already so different in terms of our kids are used to having parents, older siblings, cousins wandering in and out of the house with semi-automatic rifles. Nobody bats an eye. Nobody even mentions it, right? Um, people are used to my dad's in Miluim, my dad's gone off for reserve duty. My sister went into the army. We're going to my brother's final ceremony for his army course. And this is all before the war. Not to mention that we're used to, any kid who's taken the buses or the train has had soldiers all around them since they were born. It's not something that our kids even think about. And we certainly don't need to discuss it with them because it's as much part of their lives as the walls of their house. Um, I think that that's why the Hebrew books, the Hebrew stories were meant to start at a starting point that assumed that children already had this entire envelope, if you like, of awareness and knowledge. When you tell an Israeli kid that somebody was in a personnel carrier, they know what that is. They know what kind of an army vehicle that is. When we worked on the translations, we had to strip everything back to basics. And that was, I think, and I think that Dannii would agree with me, we had to go over mamash every single word. Um, and when this is also why when we got to the editing stage to turn the stories into the book, we had to go over all of the translations that we used. We ended up retranslating some of them, not because they weren't good translations, but because they were not appropriate for an audience that hasn't got a clue where we are, what's happening around us, what things are called, right? What a safe room is, right? A mamad. For somebody overseas, for a 7, 8, 9 year old, if we need to explain to them that all houses have either a bomb shelter or they're meant to have a bomb shelter in the basement or they have a safe room in the house. For our kids, that's just their bedroom. And
Yeah.
occasionally we fling them in there. Um, I think that it was a black and white situation. It was day and night. I think that Dannii would probably agree with me on that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if we're talking about readability and the audience of the book, um, I think, as parents, we're all parents to Israeli children, but we all grew up abroad. And I think we all know that our children are no less sensitive. They are regular
Exactly.
children. But I think what we had in mind was that not sensitivity, but just what's normal and what's not normal for children in the diaspora. Um, and that Israeli children may be no less sensitive, but as Jules said, these things are familiar, and to European children and to North American children, these things, they might have an idea of what being armed with a gun means. But actually in England, like you might not have seen that ever. You might not ever have seen someone with a
In
gun.
Canada as well, nobody in Canada, it's impossible to get a firearm.
Right. So I think that was very much in our minds when we're talking about just kind of in general, this, I think, what you want to talk about this more, but the translation for children with children in mind, but children abroad, what does Israel look like to them? What do they think of when they picture Israel? What are they picturing when they picture a war? Are they picturing World War II? So many things that we had in our
Exactly.
minds
Or
while we
Star
were
Wars.
translating. we really raked over each story with those things in mind.
Did you feel like you needed to sugarcoat certain issues?
There were
Oh, I'll
some
let Jules.
rec Dannii might have to no, Dannii will have to weigh in on this after I say this. There were many requests. I should point out that once we had come up with an initial translation, an edited version of the English, it was then sent to a child psychologist in the States, who read through every single one of them and who sent back many, many, many requests for changes and edits and deletes. And Dannii and I were not very open to that, simply because the requests were to change the nature of the story in a lot of cases, which was our red line.
What do you
I'll
mean by
just give you
that?
one
Yeah, can you give us an
small
example?
example that always sticks in my mind just because it's a very personal one. When the book was launched in Hebrew, Dannii and I went to the launch, and it was mind-blowing and heartbreaking because, and Dannii, I'm sure you remember the same thing that I do, that the minute that we stepped into the venue, we both just froze, because as we started to look around, it was like walking into the Hall of Justice. It's the only way that I can explain this. You know, like DC superheroes, we walked in, and all of a sudden there was Mali, the policewoman who had saved the police station in Sderot, and there was Rami Davidian, who had gone back and forth into the Nova site, I do not even know how many dozens of times, and saved hundreds of kids. And there, you know, and Hadass Levinson, who lost her husband, and they were just all, it was literally the Hall of Justice as far as I was concerned. And so we stood there, and we were so privileged to speak to these people, and they're normal people. I mean, Rami Davidian, who to me is, I can't even explain what a superhero this man is. He was wandering around so embarrassed because he couldn't understand what all the fuss was about, right? So I wanted to speak to one family in particular, and this is the point of all my rambling. The family of Salman Khabka, who was a Druze officer who was killed right near the beginning of the war. His parents were there, and I think his brother and his widow, who was not much older than my eldest daughter. She's maybe 24, 25. And they were sitting very quietly, sort of off to the side with a picture of him. And now this man, this officer, was unbelievable. I mean, his soldiers absolutely worshipped him. They adored him, and he saved so many lives. And they were sitting there, and I have sort of this picture of his widow etched in my head since that day. And so when we were sent a request to edit his story to the point that he gets shot at the end, obviously, and is killed. And she didn't want us to put that. I don't remember exactly what she wanted us to put. Maybe Dannii remembers. It was something along the lines of, instead of saying he was shot and died, maybe you could put his luck ran out. And at that point, both of us, I mean, the WhatsApps were flying between us. And both of us, you know, the messages sort of crossed, and we both said, absolutely not.
I
How am I
think
supposed to?
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you. I think this really, where you said just before, where you asked us, like, where did these stories meet you and at what point, it was this, that it was so real. This is our everyday lives, and it was so real to us. And there came a point where it felt like the stories they were wanting to dilute them in a way.
That's it, exactly.
Not so much sugarcoat. I don't think she was looking to sugarcoat, because to give her full credit, she was incredible to work with and fully did her job, which was to look out for the kids. And the advice and feedback she was giving us was, this sounds maybe too violent, and maybe when you say he was killed, could you say something along the lines of dot dot dot? And it met us in a really hard place, because we had walked in and met these people in real life and met their families. It was incredibly emotional. And again, I think we tried to keep in mind, like, and also tried to convey to her that, like, these aren't fairy tales. Like, a year and a bit ago, all these people were still alive. And
Exactly.
to kind of take their stories and twist them in a weird way to make it sound happier just didn't sit right with us. But at the same time, appreciating that parents and educators are not going to read the stories with kids abroad if they're too much, if it's just too much. So it was definitely us trying to find this really, really fine balance of what can they handle. And Jules put it in a really, really good way, which was, how far do we want them to come in? How far do we want to bring them in? These children that are reading these stories from another place, sitting in a completely, in their Jewish communities abroad. How far do we want them to come into this? And I would say that we had a really good moment with the psychologist, who was so helpful, where she said that she'd been working at an American Jewish summer camp, and the director had spoken to the kids there, and had come to the counselors and stuff and said, we need to figure out how we're going to talk to them about the war. And she said that what they were focusing their energies on were teaching them really about courage and hope and bravery, and unity, the unity that Am Yisrael was showing during this war. And that, of course, the stories were filled with tremendous sadness, but the book is really about celebrating those heroes. And that's where we met each other. I think we found
Absolutely.
a place back with her where we could say, we understand you and you're understanding us, and we can bring
She
this to
was
a
very
place
open
where,
to our
yeah, it really was
reactions also, I
amazingly
have to
helpful
say.
to have her.
Yeah,
Yeah,
she once we were able to express it, because I think it took us a while, right,
yeah.
Dannii? It took us a little while also to understand why we were really riled up when we
I
first
think
got her
it's
reaction.
because, I think it's because as we sat and edited, and as Jill said, a lot of the times had to retranslate from scratch, I would cry. I would sit and
Oh, so
cry
much
through a
crying.
lot of these stories.
Oh,
I
And
also did when I
then,
first read them.
yeah,
so
and
much
some
crying.
of them, again, like, we'd never heard, and it just these incredible stories. And it's still so emotional. And then to have someone say, how about we change, this, and this is very hard. And I think it's mechatchila hard for any translator to have someone and come in and correct your work, but this is like incredibly heightened emotion. But I think we did find a place where we were happy with
Definitely.
how the stories, how these heroes were represented in the end.
Mm. So that kind of leads me to another question that I had, which is, what would you say are the lessons or the legacy that we can learn from these heroes that are in the book and that are on the website? What can readers take away from these stories?
Is this where we start to cry, or are we waiting?
Yeah.
just just cue me.
Mhm.
No, it started already. I You know what? One of the things that I love about the whole project and the book and the way that it was conceived is that the intention was always for the stories to be read with a grown-up. And I think that this is so important to point out, because at some point, as people overseas start to get the book, and I really hope that they do, um, at some point, some of them are going to say, whoa, this is a bit harsh, or, my kid won't understand this, or that's the point, is that there is, I don't want to call it a learning curve, but maybe it's an emotional learning curve, which is why it says on the website and in the book, in the introduction, read this with your kids. You know your children the best. And it's our role as parents or as educators to mediate the stories for them. So I think that because of that, also, every child is going to find um, something in whichever story that speaks to them, where they can recognize themselves or somebody that it reminds them of. There's one story about a boy called Shachar that always sticks in my head. In English, I think it was called Shachar the Joker, if I'm not mistaken. Um, and he happens to be also the son of my sister-in-law's first cousin, which I didn't even realize until about a month ago. And the whole story is about this boy who, when he was small, was constantly getting into trouble at school. One of those sort of, lovable troublemakers, who was always where he wasn't supposed to be and who managed to, trick the teachers in all sorts of ways. And his mother used to, tear her hair out and what am I going to do with him? And he turned into this incredible figure in a situation that he should never have been in, that none of these people should ever have been in, where he stepped up and was a hero and displayed these qualities that he probably had since childhood, all these qualities of, being a joker and being able to improvise and be silly and all of this came together as he reached army age and found himself in this horrible situation and came together in this moment of heroism. And I think that that's what I hope the kids get from this, is that in every single story, there are people who, including a child, there are more than one. There's a child, there are teenagers, there's one teenager, we always laugh that, that our kids are on their phones too much. And this one girl basically ran a war room for a commando unit in her family's safe room on her phone. And I'm sure that the day before her mother had been yelling at her, get off your phone, right?
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that the kids see themselves not in the frightening aspects, not in the terror, God forbid, not in any of that, but in the silly bits, right? And in the absurdities of this war and how they bring out the best of us, hopefully, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
agree with you. It's so beautiful how you're phrasing this. There was one thought that I had when I was every time I read this book is that, you could look at these stories within this, this terrible vacuum of October 7th and the war. And what I appreciate about the stories that are in the book is that, first of all, they're so diverse in terms of the backgrounds of
Absolutely.
the heroes and the ages, and you see that each of them seem to like really step up and use their natural given gifts. And I think that if you're looking at the lessons in a broader scope, you start to ask yourself, you come away, you close the book and you come away thinking like, what would I do in that situation? Or what would I
Yes.
do if my
Definitely.
community needs me?
Yes. This
You
is
know?
this I always talk about this with there's actually three stories that really, really stand out for me lesson wise, if we're talking about lessons learned. But that element of what would I do? I always talk about Ophic's little white car. The
Oh, that's
story of
right.
Ophic Livni, who had been at the Nova Festival, and he just kind of jumps in his car and piles people in, as many people as he can. And on the way calls his dad, and his dad, as they say in Hebrew, with kol ruach, just kind of directed them how to leave. He said, don't drive down this way, drive down that way, drive through potato fields, don't drive through fields that have been irrigated so you don't get stuck in. The dad
Very
just kind of
clear.
directed
He
them
was
and
so clear-minded.
very clear. And him kind of this image of Ophik packed, this little car packed with people. And he stopped at one point
Absolutely.
to chuck everything out of his trunk to get two more girls in.
That's right.
And this idea, this is so the Israeli spirit for me, like the bravery, the courage, the calling your dad to get you, to direct you, and always thinking
Absolutely.
about other people, just this thing of as many people as I can get in this car. So that, like the Israeli spirit. And I always think when I think about Ofik and in that moment, I always think I hope that I would be like him. I hope I would have been like just as many people as you can, just pile into the car, this kind of this real courage and bravery that sums up the Israeli spirit. And it also leads always, I always think of these three stories together. I don't know why, maybe I did them on the same day, but Um, there's this story about Hannah Gottfried, the
Mhm.
Holocaust survivor who's 88 years old. It's a story called Hannah Gives Us Wings, and how she goes to visit the children of Kibbutz Mefarsim, how they were all moved to a hotel in Herzliya, and she goes to visit them, and she tells them about how her life, just like theirs, within one day, completely, was completely changed overnight. How everyone she knew disappeared and people she loved were gone. And, the rug was just completely pulled out from her. And she talks to these children, and she says, when I look into the eyes of other Holocaust survivors, I see superheroes. And she said it, I'm gonna cry, but she says that she looks in their eyes, and she says, that's what I see when I look in your eyes. And I think it's such an incredible story of hope that she with all her trauma and lived, through this as a 4-year-old, can go to these small children and give them hope. um I just find that like
Absolutely.
it's such a part of our story as Am Yisrael. And so there's this like Ofek with the bravery and her kind of giving this incredible hope to these children who have lost so much. And then the last one I always connect with this is the story. I know Jules also really connects with this one of the Slutky brothers
Oh,
of
now I'm gonna cry.
Yishai,
Okay.
Yishai and Noam, who I think Bal Manor wrote their story. And I mean, they're also their courage that they just threw themselves in on October 7th. And there's all this footage of them, you know, just fighting until the end together, and they fell together. And Balmanol wrote this story, and he writes this one line, and I wrote it down just so I would remember in our talk to read it out. He writes this one line. He says, they understood that a brave heart was needed to protect the land and its people, and a hero doesn't stand on the side when their Jewish brothers and sisters are in need. And I feel like if there's anything to take away from these stories and from October 7th, it's that. I feel like that really sums it up for me.
Amen. Absolutely.
Very
Yeah,
powerful.
sorry, it's a lot.
No, it's
Anybody here not crying now?
yeah.
I was actually going to say, Dannii, of those three stories that you mentioned, if anybody really wants to have a good weep, all three of those, there are videos on YouTube. There's actually a video of Hannah talking to the little kids at the hotel. Um, and there's a video of Ofek that he took while he was in the car, and he's talking to his dad. And what you said about, how he kept getting people in the car. At some point, there were people literally, there were like legs and arms hanging out the windows. It was like a clown car in a circus.
Yeah,
And he's driving through the fields, and you can just see, the back of his head from whoever's filming him from behind. And you can hear his dad's voice, and he says to him, Abba, he says, he says to him, I can't get anybody else in. And his father says to him, it's okay, just keep going. But I think that that's exactly what Dannii said, that even with people, Mamash, he had somebody, holding onto the roof at one point, and he still wanted to stop and get more in, right?
yeah.
I
And
think
what
that's
an
so cool.
incredible dogma, like what an incredible personal example.
Absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
really hope that I know that the English book is geared to a slightly older age, and I really hope that they take that from these stories, these messages, these lessons of just so much courage and bravery, and for really, yeah, I just really hope they take that away with them.
I
So,
mean, you think that these are the same people who, a week before maybe would have cut in line, in the supermarket, and we would have muttered
yeah,
something to ourselves, and, or somebody cuts you off, in your lane. And it's the same people. It's the same people, that we were cross with this morning, who didn't cross on the crosswalk or whatever. It's the same
yeah,
people,
Yeah.
which I think
Um,
is a big part of the message.
we and the entire team has spoken about the educational lessons and the potential for this book. And I know that there will be educators, Hebrew school teachers, Israel education classes that will be watching this video. And I am curious if you have any suggestions for ways to use this book and as a platform. What's your vision for this in terms of English speakers here in Israel and abroad in an educational sense?
I really hope that overseas, um, that they let the kids sort of meet this at a very personal level. One thing that I saw the website was used for here. Dannii and I both have kids in the same school here in Bernstein. And um, we have kids in the same class, and their teacher last year already, when the Hebrew book had only been out for a couple of months, but the website had been up for a while, she assigned, she told every kid in the class to get on the website and choose one story and then find out about them and learn about them and tell the class about them. And it was incredible to see how close the children allowed themselves to get to it. And I think that they needed it also. I think that this is something that's very important. When you're teaching children, and I mean here up until around bar bat mitzvah ages, right? Because then, of course, everything starts to change. But before that, they're still kids, and they need to be able to feel their own emotions as they're reading it, and giving them that space and that time with one story to focus on to begin with, I think is very important. I know that when my 11-year-old did it, she afterwards she found it she was it was very important for her to go to her ceramics class after that and make a stand for a memorial candle for Yom HaZikaron, right? With the name on it of the person that she had found out about it. And we lit it again on Yom Kippur, we lit it, and on the 7th and Shmini Atzeret, and I mean, I may as well just keep it lit all year at this point. But it made it easier for her, and through her, the younger ones also, because then they say, "Who is that?" Right? And then they sort of pass it down to their siblings, and children are able to communicate it to each other at that level because that's their natural way of expressing themselves. They don't need to think it through like we do. They don't have to question, is this too much? Am I being too blatant? That's who they are, and that's where they meet their friends also when they're discussing it. One thing that Dannii said earlier that I thought was very important was, how far in are we going to let them? It's not because, God forbid, we're trying to keep them out. The kids overseas, we want them to feel as close to us as possible. We want them to feel close to the country, close to the people here, close to the soldiers, the heroes. But because we are raising children here, there are things that we would not wish on these kids, right? And at that point, I think that we both agree that while we had to maintain the integrity of the stories and of the heroes themselves, there were some things that were still just too much. So as we let them in, or as the teachers are presenting them overseas, I think that really the material that's online, the educational, the suggestions for classroom stuff, I think are really spot on. And I think that as the teachers become more familiar with it, as with anything else, they'll be able to play around with it a little more. But at the beginning, I would say it's probably a good idea to stick to what's there. And we're all available to speak to them also. I think that that's also very important. I think Dannii would probably agree with me. Because we all grew up overseas, I think that we're all available if the teachers have questions or if the kids want to ask us questions, right? Because we do have that sort of familiarity with both cultures, which I think is important.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And
Yeah,
go
I
ahead,
want to add
Dannii.
one thing. I think everything that Jules said, and just to add that from kind of for teachers, educators, even parents, but if you're standing in front of a group of kids, um, my hope, kind of as we were translating, was not just that the book is taken and used to just learn about October 7th and the war, and that perspective on Israel, but that they'll stand in front of a group of children abroad who may have never been here, who know that they have a connection with here, and there's some kind of allegiance that we feel with Israel, and that it's so important to us as Israel, but they may have never stepped foot in Israel. So my hope is that the book also is also used as a tool to understand somewhat about the diversity of Israeli society, and that all of these heroes, every person discussed in this book, as you said it before, Yehudi, that just they come from such different backgrounds, and they're all talked about in the context of either their families or where they were on that day, and just so many different circumstances, even just to compare like two soldiers that are mentioned in the book. And when Jewish children abroad may think of an Israeli soldier, depending on what school you're at, depending on what, where you are on the spectrum of, like, Judaism, anything, that word soldier may fall for you differently. And when you picture that girl or boy, who are you talking about? And I feel like from the macro to the micro, you can really jump in with this book. And if I think off the top of my head, there's a story about Barnash, the hilltop youth, as they
Yeah,
call
yeah.
him, who became a Nachal commander, and Levi's camera, who's a very different type of personality, so gentle, and how much he cherished his art and his camera. And he was also so grateful for his army service, and he wrote that in his last letter. Just those two Chayalim, just to compare their stories. And when you put them side by side in a book, you may understand just a tiny bit more what Israel is and what is happening here. And I hope that that's something that's conveyed.
Well, I want to thank you both very, very much for taking the time to speak with me about the heroes of October 7th. You both did an outstanding job at translating these stories. And when I say translating, I mean both literally and figuratively, but basically to convey um, these superheroes, to the world. And I really feel like you've done a public service. So I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me about this. And I hope that this video is helpful for parents and for educators out there who, want to read the book and to bring it into their homes and bring it into their schools. And if anyone has any questions, of course, you could reach out to us. And please check out the website. It's Giborim, uh, Giborim-kids.com. And I will put the link below. And please, buy the book. It's on Amazon. It's in bookstores, in Jewish bookstores everywhere. And a portion of the proceeds from the book are going to support Brothers for Life, Achim LaAchim. It's an organization that helps rehabilitate Israeli soldiers who have been severely wounded while protecting us and our country. So again, thank you so much, and
Thank
I
you.
look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.